Queen Mary didn't welcome women into the royal family the way ordinary mothers welcome daughters-in-law. She inspected them. She measured their breeding, their manners, their jewels, their usefulness, their obedience, and their ability to disappear into the institution without making trouble. To marry one of Queen Mary's sons wasn't simply to join a family. It was to enter a house where every object had a history, every gesture had a rank, and every woman was expected to understand that the crown came before comfort. Queen Mary could give advice, approval, and magnificent jewels, but she could also correct, freeze, and remind a woman exactly where she stood. The daughters-in-law didn't just marry princes. They married into Queen Mary's rules. Her treatment of those women reveals how the Windsor family turned marriage into institutional discipline, and how women entering the monarchy were expected to surrender personality, property, and emotional freedom to the crown. She was born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck on May 26, 1867, at Kensington Palace. The Teck background is essential. Her father, Francis, Duke of Teck, held the morganatic rank of Serene Highness rather than Royal Highness, which, in the precise, pitiless arithmetic of 19th-century European courts, placed him a full grade below the families he moved among. His parents' marriage had been socially unequal by dynastic standards, and that distinction wasn't ceremonial. It meant his children moved inside the royal world without fully belonging to it, attending the right dinners, standing in the right rooms, and knowing at all times that their presence was conditional in a way that the presence of fully royal people wasn't. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, known across London as Fat Mary, a reference to her impressive size and her more impressive debts, was warm, affectionate, generous to the point of recklessness, and financially catastrophic. The family's creditors eventually required them to leave England. They decamped to Florence, where they lived in a villa and conducted the morganatic version of royal life abroad, making the best of limited resources and maintaining the forms of dignity on an inadequate budget. Princess May grew up understanding, in the most practical possible terms, the difference between standing near power and actually possessing it. Her father's obsession with precedence and rank wasn't eccentricity. It was a rational response to living just below the accepted line of full royal dignity. Every slight to his standing, every reminder of the morganatic clause, every occasion on which full royals received courtesies he didn't, these accumulated into an orientation, a way of seeing the world in which rank meant safety, and any ambiguity about rank meant vulnerability. His daughter absorbed that orientation completely. She understood, before she was an adult, that propriety meant belonging, that rank had to be maintained with relentless attention, and that the only real security available to someone in her position was the crown's approval. In November 1891, Princess May became engaged to Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, eldest son of the Prince of Wales and first in line to the throne. The engagement secured what her entire childhood had been spent approaching: full entry into the royal circle her family had always orbited but never quite reached. On January 14, 1892, Albert Victor died of influenza, aged 28. Princess May was 24, her entire future organized around a man who was suddenly gone. 16 months later, on July 6, 1893, she married his younger brother, Prince George, who would become King George V. She didn't resist this arrangement. The crown needed a suitable wife for the new heir apparent. Princess May had already been verified as suitable, her breeding confirmed, her conduct approved, her Protestant credentials established. She was therefore redirected. Her engagement transferred from one prince to his surviving brother, with the same administrative logic that governed any royal function's reassignment. The function needed filling. The person was incidental to the function. That structural fact is the moral foundation of everything she would later enforce. She hadn't arrived at the institution as a free agent who then chose submission. She'd been submitted before she ever had the authority to submit anyone else. The Crown had processed her first, had treated her as an institutional instrument before she was ever in a position to treat others the same way. She'd looked at that experience and concluded, over decades of living inside the system, that it was correct, that the Crown should come first, that personal preference was beside the point. She wasn't performing belief. She held it, completely and without apparent internal conflict, until she died on March 24, 1953. James Pope Hennessy spent 4 years writing the authorized biography. He'd been invited to undertake the work in 1955, and the result, published in 1959 by George Allen and Unwin, was the official portrait. Queen Elizabeth II gave him unrestricted access to the royal archives at Windsor. Queen Mary's daily diaries, kept continuously from 1891 through the year of her death, the full correspondence between her and George V across 43 years of marriage, the family letters spanning 4 generations. He also interviewed surviving members of the household, friends, courtiers, equerries, people who had known her across her life. Pope Hennessy wasn't a simple court apologist. He had a complicated private life and a novelist's instinct for the gap between public performance and private reality. He collected private notes alongside the authorized research, observations in his own voice, alongside testimony from people who'd known Queen Mary well enough to have opinions about her that differed from the official portrait. He was murdered in 1974, stabbed at his London home, before he could do anything further with that material. Hugo Vickers edited the notes and published them in 2018 as The Quest for Queen Mary, describing the volume as providing much greater insight into Queen Mary than the official version. The private notes describe her social manner as stiff and cold and distant, awkward in conversation, often standing silent and rigid, cleaning her teeth with her tongue, waiting for others to talk. Lord Claude Hamilton, who served as her extra equerry, described her to Pope Hennessy as one of the most selfish human beings I have ever known. These assessments come from Pope Hennessy's private observations and from testimony gathered from people in her immediate circle. They require a specific caveat. Pope Hennessy's own account of his method suggests he intended to present Queen Mary publicly as grander than she was, while privately documenting her eccentricities. He described wanting to smuggle in a big load of irony into the official biography. His private notes aren't direct, neutral testimony. They're one writer's assessments, shaped by his own temperament and by sources who had their own reasons for the views they expressed. What's less mediated is Queen Mary's own record. Her diaries ran daily from 1891 to 1953. Her letters to George V document their partnership across 4 decades. And her official biographer, writing with full access to those archives, characterized her as a woman who had put her country before everything else throughout her life, a position she couldn't change. That characterization explains the abdication, explains her response to it, and explains every management decision she'd made about every daughter-in-law in the preceding 15 years. Princess Margaret, Queen Mary's granddaughter, described her as excruciatingly shy and emotionally unavailable as a mother. George V communicated with his sons primarily by letter, even when they were living under the same roof at Sandringham or Balmoral, and was, by several biographers' assessments, consistently harsh with them. Queen Mary's contribution to the household atmosphere was a different kind of absence. Formal, correct. A person who stood in her own rooms in the fixed posture of someone for whom public and private were the same register, because she'd never been able to separate them. The House of Windsor came into existence with a name change in July 1917. George V renamed the dynasty from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, a decision driven by the political embarrassment of fighting Germany while bearing a German family name. The change was administrative, not structural. What the dynasty required from the women who married into it had been codified long before the name changed. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 was still operative throughout Queen Mary's era, requiring the sovereign's approval for the marriages of all royal descendants and stripping succession rights from children born of unapproved unions. Marriage into the royal family wasn't a private transaction between two families. It was a constitutional act with consequences that extended across the dynasty's entire succession framework. The women who arrived at the altar in Westminster Abbey were entering a legal structure as much as a household. What the institution required from daughters-in-law broke down into several distinct, measurable functions. Fertility was primary. The dynasty's continuity depended entirely on legitimate heirs, and a marriage that failed to produce them was, by the system's framework, a failure, regardless of what the individuals concerned might feel about it. Class credentials and breeding came next. Protestant aristocracy, preferably British, uncontaminated by scandal, foreign political entanglement, or the kind of personal history that created constitutional complications. Public image management was an ongoing obligation, not a skill that could be developed gradually, but a standard to be maintained from the first public appearance. And beneath all these requirements was the foundational demand that the woman entering the institution would subordinate her personal identity to the institutional one until the two were indistinguishable. Each marriage also carried distinct risks. A foreign princess might carry foreign loyalties or activate foreign political obligations. A British aristocrat without sufficient dignity might expose the household to public contempt. A divorcee, and here the system had a very specific structural problem, created a constitutional collision that the institution couldn't absorb. The monarch was head of the Church of England. The Church of England refused to sanction the marriages of divorced persons. A king who proposed to marry a woman twice divorced would be proposing a union that his own church formally disallowed. That specific problem hadn't been tested at the highest level as of April 1923. 13 years later, it would be, with results nobody had fully modeled. Prince Albert, Bertie, the second son, had a significant stammer that worsened under pressure, a quick temper, and an anxious constitution that several people who knew him closely found worrying. He wasn't the sort of man for whom public life came easily, and he knew it. He fell in love with Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, daughter of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, whose family held Glamis Castle in Angus and St. Paul's Walden Bury in Hertfordshire. He proposed at least twice before she accepted, in January 1923. Elizabeth told friends she'd feared what accepting would mean, the foreclosure of the private life she might otherwise have had. She accepted regardless. Prince Albert wrote to his mother throughout the courtship, keeping her informed of each step in a correspondence that places Queen Mary's awareness of the situation well before any formal announcement. No document has been found in which Queen Mary explicitly set out her dynastic reasoning for approving the match. Her approval is demonstrated through action rather than declaration. On January 27, 1923, she wrote a thank you letter following the engagement announcement. Decades later, that letter was discovered being used as a bookmark in a second-hand book bought by someone with no connection to the royal family whatsoever. A detail so particular that it resists invention. The letter had traveled from Marlborough House into a bookshop and finally into a book dealer's hands, forgotten as a personal document, reduced to a scrap of paper between the pages of a volume nobody remembered. That trajectory says something about how Queen Mary's courtesy operated. Correct, prompt, materially real, and essentially impersonal. The wedding took place on April 26, 1923, at Westminster Abbey. Queen Mary's gift to Elizabeth was a suite of diamonds and sapphires, a fringe necklace, a corsage brooch, 2 smaller brooches, a ring, and a bracelet. The gift wasn't warm generosity. It was institutional recognition, the material signal that this woman had been accepted into the hierarchy and would now be equipped accordingly. What Elizabeth brought the institution was considerable. Scottish aristocracy meant Protestant, British, and socially unimpeachable, all the credentials the system required without the complications of foreign royal blood or political entanglement. Her warmth and public charm were the exact complement to Bertie's stammering difficulty in public settings. She could absorb his tension and present the household as functional when it wasn't. She bore 2 daughters, Elizabeth in April 1926, Margaret in August 1930, demonstrating that the marriage was productive. By 1936, when George VI acceded to the throne after the abdication, Elizabeth was already fluent enough in the institution's requirements to assume the role of queen consort without visible adjustment. The relationship between Queen Mary and Elizabeth wasn't warm friendship. It was a formal compact between 2 women who understood the rules well enough to operate alongside each other without friction. From the beginning, Elizabeth understood what ceremonial courtesy was expected of her, and delivered it without being asked. Shortly after leaving on honeymoon in April 1923, she wrote a letter to Queen Mary that biographers have described as wistful in its acknowledgement of what she'd joined. A gesture of preemptive deference that suggests Elizabeth grasped, immediately and clearly, that the relationship required that courtesy as a baseline. Those who watched Elizabeth closely over decades produced descriptions that capture what she actually was underneath the performance. Stephen Tennant, who moved in her social orbit across many years, wrote, "She looked everything that she wasn't. Gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity, cool, well-bred, remote. Behind this veil, she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails." Cecil Beaton, who photographed her across 4 decades, described her as a marshmallow made on a welding machine. Harold Nicholson, the diplomat and diarist, called her the greatest queen since Cleopatra. These aren't descriptions of a woman being passively absorbed into a system. They're descriptions of a woman who examined the system, grasped its requirements entirely, and decided to outperform it on its own terms. To be more Windsor than the Windsors by adding the warmth they couldn't manufacture. The institution paid its debts accordingly. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon went from Scottish aristocrat to Duchess of York to Queen Consort to Queen Mother, living to March 2002, outlasting nearly everyone else in this story by decades. She understood how the institution rewarded fluency in its own rules. The 1934 wedding was a different kind of spectacle. Prince George, the 4th son, charming, beautiful, notoriously unreliable in the years before his marriage, was created Duke of Kent on October 9, 1934, and married Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark at Westminster Abbey on November 29. It was the first major royal wedding in 11 years. It was also the first royal wedding broadcast by wireless. Microphones had been connected to a control room built beneath the unknown warrior's tomb, and the service was transmitted across Britain and overseas, with loudspeakers positioned outside the abbey, so the crowds gathered in the cold November air could hear every word of the ceremony as clearly as if they were inside. Marina was born on December 13, 1906, in Athens, during the reign of her grandfather, King George I of Greece. Her father was Prince Nicholas of Greece and Denmark. Her mother was Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna of Russia, granddaughter of Emperor Alexander II. Through her father's family, she and Prince Philip were cousins. Her bloodline was formidable by any dynastic reckoning. Greek royal through two separate lines, Danish royal through the Glucksburg connection, Russian imperial through her mother's Romanov inheritance. The Greek royal family was forced into exile when Marina was 11. She spent her adolescence and early adulthood living between Paris and the extended family's households scattered across Europe, moving in the world on the strength of impeccable but unsecured credentials. By the time she arrived in London for her engagement, she was 27, precise in her bearing, and accustomed to presenting herself with authority in rooms where she was always, technically, a guest. She was also extraordinary to look at. Contemporary photographs show a face with the kind of precise, severe beauty that required no assistance from setting or angle. Dark, strongly defined features, a quality of composure that read as confidence rather than reserve. Her influence on British fashion in the 1930s was immediate and documented. The color Marina blue, a particular shade of blue she favored, passed into common British usage within months of her arrival. By 1960, she'd been inducted into the International Best Dressed List Hall of Fame. The attention she attracted was, in one sense, exactly what the institution required from a royal bride. Public fascination, positive coverage, the kind of glamour that deflected scrutiny from the more complicated corners of the family. In another sense, it was slightly more attention than a system built on managed invisibility was comfortable with. Prince George's earlier life had given Queen Mary considerable anxiety. His personal habits had been erratic, his finances unreliable, his social world more bohemian and less controllable than his position required. Marina's combination of unimpeachable bloodlines, formidable personal discipline, and commanding public presence was, in the institution's judgment, exactly what his life required. Marina's biographer, Christopher Warwick, documented the institutional verdict directly. The king and queen were supportive of the couple. In their view, Marina was a stabilizing force in George's life and the right sort of person. That phrase, the right sort of person, is the system's assessment in its most compressed form. It says nothing about personal affection. It says everything about function. Marina had actually met Queen Mary before, at 3 years old, a 1910 visit to Britain following the death of Edward VII. Queen Mary reportedly treated the young Marina and her sisters as if they were her own children. 24 years later, that early acquaintance had matured into institutional approval. Queen Mary gave specifically and significantly within that compact the Cambridge sapphires, a collection she'd inherited in 1916 from her aunt, Grand Duchess Augusta of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, were gifted to Marina. These weren't decorative afterthoughts. They were historically weighted pieces that Queen Mary had already incorporated into her own dynastic use, reworking other portions of the Cambridge collection into her famous Delhi Durbar parure in 1911. Giving the sapphires to Marina placed the new Duchess inside the circulation of objects that carried dynastic history. A gesture that said, within the institution's own symbolic language, that Marina now had legitimate claim to a portion of the family's material heritage. In 1935, Queen Mary loaned Marina the bandeau tiara for a formal ball, a smaller gesture, but the same logic. Objects moved between women according to occasion and institutional function. Marina understood what she'd entered. She missed her family, she was lonely, and she understood it as her duty to adapt. That framing comes from her own biographer's account of her inner life during these years. Not that she found it easy, or chose it freely, but that she absorbed it as obligation. She'd learned the institution's primary lesson before she'd been inside it long enough to resent it. On July 4th, 1942, Marina gave birth to their third child, Prince Michael of Kent. Prince George was on active service. 7 weeks later, on August 25, 1942, he was killed when a RAF Short Sunderland flying boat crashed into a hill near Dunbeath in Caithness, Scotland. He was 39. Marina was 35, widowed with an infant and 2 other small children. Prince Edward was 6, Princess Alexandra 5. The bureaucratic reality of what followed was recorded years later by Hugo Vickers. Marina was the only war widow in Britain whose estate was forced to pay death duties. Every other war widow received an exemption, not the Duchess of Kent. Her husband had died in RAF uniform on active service, and the state's administrative machinery treated that death as an ordinary financial event subject to ordinary inheritance taxation. During her early widowhood, Marina stayed often at Marlborough House with Queen Mary. The proximity was real. Her mother-in-law was available, the visits happened, and Queen Mary had written about George as "my precious Georgie" in her diary. What the visits could provide was limited by the nature of the house they were happening in. What Queen Mary's institutional inheritance couldn't offer Marina was the kind of straightforward human sympathy that grief without ceremony requires. The Grace and Favor apartment at Kensington Palace that was eventually arranged for Marina wasn't confirmed until 1954, the year after Queen Mary's death. Marina continued. Royal engagements, patronages, Commonwealth representation, the routine of public obligation that the institution substituted for anything it couldn't provide. In 1957, when Ghana achieved independence, she was appointed to represent the Queen at the independence celebrations. She served as president of the Wimbledon All-England Lawn Tennis and Croquet Club for 26 years. She was president of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution from 1943 until her death, receiving the institution's gold medal in 1967. She died on August 27, 1968, at Kensington Palace of a brain tumor, aged 61. She'd played by the rules her entire adult life and had been rewarded materially with Cambridge sapphires and a Grace and Favor apartment and a place in the most famous family in the world. The same rules hadn't exempted her estate from death duties when her husband was killed in uniform. Bessie Wallace Warfield was born in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, in June 1896. Her first marriage, to Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., a naval aviator whose alcoholism made the marriage unworkable, ended in divorce. Her second marriage, to Ernest Simpson, a shipping executive, provided what one biographer described as security and social standing, a comfortable London base, access to society, the financial stability her first marriage had lacked. They married in 1928. By the early 1930s, she was a fixture in the world that surrounded the Prince of Wales, the house parties at Fort Belvedere, the dinners, the yachts, the close and increasingly possessive inner circle that formed around Edward's considerable personal charisma and his evident need for unconditional approval. On January 20, 1936, George V died at Sandringham. Queen Mary was present. Edward VIII ascended to the throne. By that autumn, the constitutional crisis was apparent to the government, to the church, and to everyone in the palace who had understood for months that the crisis was coming and had not been able to prevent it. Wallis Simpson's systematic incompatibility with the institution's requirements was the most thorough the system had ever encountered. She was American, not aristocratic, not Protestant in any politically relevant sense, not positioned to absorb a British royal identity because she possessed too strong and too particular an identity of her own. She'd been divorced twice, which created the specific constitutional problem the system had no solution for. The King of England, as head of the Church of England, proposing to enter a union the Church formally disallowed. Frances Donaldson spent 4 years researching her acclaimed 1974 biography of Edward VIII and examined every possible dimension of the official anxiety around Wallis. Her conclusion was that the only fear regarding Wallis Simpson was her influence over the king, and that she was innocent of all German tendencies or connections. The political and security concerns were noise. The structural problem was simpler and worse. She also couldn't perform the institutional disappearance the system demanded. Every woman who entered the Windsor family successfully had managed, in one way or another, to become less herself and more the role, to let the dynastic identity colonize the personal one. Wallis was doing the opposite. She was making Edward less the king and more her companion, reordering his priorities in a direction the institution couldn't follow. Queen Mary didn't respond to this situation with anger. She responded with institutional conviction. She led the palace's resistance. Secondary accounts are clear that it was Queen Mary who led the palace faction against the Simpson marriage. Lord Wigram, the palace official, drafted communications to Edward that were directed at Queen Mary's behest. The formal channels of institutional pressure moved in coordinated fashion, with Queen Mary as the organizing center of the opposition. She wasn't outraged in a personal sense. She was applying the same operating principle she'd lived by since 1893. The crown came first. A king who couldn't accept that was a king who couldn't be king. The New York Times, reviewing Pope Hennessy's authorized biography in 1959, recorded that the abdication had grieved Queen Mary and that the official biographer had said she'd scolded Edward. The historical record from that period suggests considerably more than a scolding. The communications coming from the palace on the subject of Edward's future were, by one contemporaneous account, so peremptory in their tone that they functioned as institutional commands rather than maternal appeals. Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication on December 10, 1936. His reign had lasted 326 days. He became the Duke of Windsor. He married Wallis Simpson on June 3, 1937. No senior member of the family attended. The title was created for him. His wife was denied the style of Royal Highness that accompanied it, a constitutional slight that the institution maintained for the rest of both their lives, and which the Duke spent decades trying unsuccessfully to reverse. Queen Mary declined every subsequent opportunity to meet the Duchess of Windsor. The documentation for this position comes from secondary accounts rather than confirmed primary records, but it's entirely consistent with how the institution managed permanent exclusion. It didn't announce its verdicts or explain its reasoning. It stopped extending invitations. The door closed and stayed closed. Pope Hennessy encountered Wallis in person while researching the official biography. His private journal records that she struck him as one of the very oddest women I have ever met. That observation didn't appear in the 1959 biography. He understood which version of events the authorized record was supposed to preserve. One clarification the record requires: the phrase, "that woman," widely attributed to Queen Mary in popular accounts of the abdication and its aftermath, wasn't hers. Anne Seba, whose 2011 biography was the first full-scale study of Wallis Simpson written by a woman, identified the phrase as belonging to Queen Elizabeth, meaning Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, the Queen Mother. The woman who'd most fluently learned Queen Mary's rules was also the one who most vividly articulated the institution's contempt for the woman who'd refused them. Her official biographer captured her position in terms that required no elaboration. She had put her country before everything else throughout her adult life, and that wasn't going to change. She intended her eldest son to understand, finally, that there wasn't going to be a negotiation. The jewel stories require careful accounting because the popular narrative and the documented one diverge in ways that matter to what the evidence can actually support. The documented record shows primarily Queen Mary giving, inheriting, purchasing, and bequeathing, not taking, from daughters-in-law. The gifts were significant and specific. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon received, on her April 26, 1923 wedding day, a suite of diamonds and sapphires, fringe necklace, corsage brooch, 2 smaller brooches, ring, and bracelet. Marina received the Cambridge sapphires, historically significant pieces Queen Mary had inherited in 1916 from Grand Duchess Augusta of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and in 1935 had the bandeau tiara on loan from Queen Mary for a formal ball. When Queen Mary died on March 24, 1953, the bulk of her collection passed to Queen Elizabeth II. The Cambridge emeralds entered the permanent royal collection. In 1981, Queen Elizabeth II gave Queen Mary's Art Deco emerald choker to Diana, Princess of Wales, as a wedding gift. The emeralds circulating to one more daughter-in-law 28 years after Queen Mary's death. Queen Mary was also an active acquirer throughout her lifetime, through documented and defensible channels. In 1921, she purchased the Vladimir tiara from the estate of Grand Duchess Vladimir of Russia, one of the exiled European royals who, in the wake of the revolution, were liquidating significant assets at whatever price circumstances allowed. She reworked pieces. The Cambridge emeralds were incorporated into her Delhi Durbar parure in 1911. When Queen Alexandra died, she distributed Alexandra's jewelry according to Alexandra's expressed final wishes, functioning as executor rather than beneficiary, describing the task in her diary as interesting but sad. One assessment of her acquisition practices concluded she was documented as having paid fair prices for everything she bought, while acknowledging the circumstances of some transactions were effectively coercive. Sellers who felt unable to decline a Queen of England's expressed interest in an object might not have experienced the resulting sale as entirely free. That tension sits in the record and doesn't resolve cleanly. The category of stories about Queen Mary arriving at sick rooms and deathbeds to claim objects before families could act? The stories that popular accounts have labeled the coffin jewels belongs to a different and far less verifiable register. These stories circulate in popular histories and have been codified in entertainment-grade accounts of the period. No primary document, no contemporaneous diary account, no reliably sourced record identifying a specific incident has been traced in available scholarship. The origin of these stories can't be established from the historical record. They persist because they capture something about Queen Mary's reputation that the documented record does partially support. Her absolute conviction that dynastic objects belong to the dynasty rather than to the individuals temporarily in possession of them, and her willingness to act on that conviction decisively. The documented picture is actually more revealing than the popular one. Queen Mary didn't hoard or steal. She managed. Objects moved through her hands according to institutional logic, inherited when inheritance was appropriate, purchased when purchase preserved significant pieces within the royal sphere, given when giving served the crown's purposes, and bequeathed upward to the institution rather than distributed laterally to individuals who might eventually take them outside the dynasty. Personal attachment to an object was simply not the relevant framework. An emerald that had been part of the Cambridge collection for generations wasn't a personal possession she happened to enjoy wearing. It was a dynastic asset under her stewardship for as long as she lived. That's the same logic that governed her treatment of daughters-in-law. Women entering the family were also, in structural terms, assets whose management served the dynasty. The institution welcomed them when they served its purposes, directed them when they didn't, and, in the extreme case, excluded them permanently when they proved incompatible with the system's requirements. The mechanism of control wasn't primarily verbal. It operated through the management of access, warmth, and material recognition, through what was given and what was withheld, through who was included and at what ceremonial distance. George V and Queen Mary communicated with their children primarily by letter, even under the same roof. Their sons experienced childhood as a regime of formal correspondence, public obligation, and the particular emotional coldness that comes from parents who have systematized their distance. Queen Mary's manner in social settings was described in Pope Hennessy's notes as stiff and cold and distant, awkward in conversation, often standing silent and rigid, cleaning her teeth with her tongue, waiting for others to talk. Princess Margaret described her as excruciatingly shy and emotionally unavailable as a mother. These characterizations come from different sources, across different periods, and point to the same thing: a person who had collapsed the distinction between public and private comportment, because the public register was the only one she'd ever found safe. Her father's precedence anxiety had taught her that rank required maintenance. Her mother's warmth had been associated with financial disaster and social embarrassment. The lesson available in the household she'd grown up in was that formality was correct, that emotional openness carried risk, and that the Crown's requirements took absolute precedence over personal comfort in all circumstances. She'd internalized that lesson so completely that she probably couldn't have violated it even if she'd wanted to. For daughters-in-law, this translated into a specific experiential reality.
Approval communicated itself through formal cooperation, through wedding gifts of diamonds and sapphires, through jewel loans that signaled inclusion, through the subtle warmth of being invited to the right occasions at the right frequency. Disapproval communicated itself through withdrawal, through silence in circumstances where acknowledgement would previously have been offered, through the gradual reduction of the small ceremonial courtesies that, in a household where every gesture carried rank, were never actually small. A woman who understood the rules would understand what the silence meant without being told. A woman who didn't would find herself unable to locate the exact edges of what she'd done wrong. Marina understood. She wrote to her friend Betty Lawson Johnston in November 1944 in terms that describe loneliness while maintaining the forms of acceptance. A private acknowledgement that the institution's warmth had limits, combined with a public life that showed no sign of protest. She'd absorbed the system's requirements so completely that even her private grief was expressed through the institution's framework, rather than against it. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon navigated the dynamic differently. She didn't absorb the emotional distance. She operated around it, maintaining all the correct ceremonial forms while building her own influence through the warmth and public charm that the Windsors couldn't manufacture for themselves. She filled the emotional spaces the institution left empty, which made her indispensable rather than merely compliant. By the time George VI died in February 1952, and she became the Queen Mother, she'd transformed the role from ceremonial adjunct into an independent 40-year public career. Wallace didn't manage it at all. The institution's fundamental demand was a demand she was constitutionally unable or unwilling to satisfy. Its response was to make her invisible through permanent exclusion rather than absorption. That exclusion was enforced without ceremony and maintained without explanation. Queen Mary died on March 24, 1953, at Marlborough House, 85 years old and 6 weeks before the coronation of her granddaughter. She'd outlasted George V, outlasted Prince George, outlasted the abdication crisis, and outlasted almost everyone who'd been present for the first meeting at which she'd assessed Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon as the right sort of person for her second son. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon lived until March 2002, nearly 50 years beyond Queen Mary's death. Hugo Vickers organized his authorized biography of Elizabeth the Queen Mother to address both the abdication and the problems with Diana within a single biographical arc. The same institutional pattern, the same structural responses, appearing across two crises 50 years apart. Whether Elizabeth consciously modeled her handling of Diana Spencer on Queen Mary's management of difficult cases isn't something primary sources document explicitly. What the record shows is the same structural logic operating in recognizable form: the expectation that a woman entering the Windsor family would subordinate her personal identity to the institutional one. The same mechanisms of formal silence when she didn't, the same withdrawal of support. Diana had already provided what the system required: the heir in June 1982, the spare in September 1984, which made the situation structurally more complicated than Wallace's had been. The institution had been designed to handle women who stayed outside. Managing a woman who stayed inside and refused to disappear proved considerably more damaging than exclusion would have been. Queen Mary's era was simpler in that one respect. Women entered the house. Those who understood the rules remained. Those who complied fully enough to be useful flourished. The one who refused was removed. The house survived. The simpler story available here is one in which Queen Mary is a villain, stripping women of individuality, demanding submission with aristocratic imperviousness, using the crown as an instrument against anyone who fell short of her standards. The evidence doesn't support that story. What it supports is something harder to argue with. She wasn't designing cruelty. She was enforcing a system she'd believed in since the day she was transferred from one dead prince to his surviving brother, since her childhood in a family that had experienced firsthand and in financial detail what it cost to live just below the accepted line of royal dignity. The institution had processed her first. It had required her to become something before she had the authority to require anything of others. She'd met that requirement and found, over 60 years of meeting it, that the system was worth what it asked. That belief, absolute, unironic, carried without apparent internal conflict from her 1893 wedding until her death, is what made her not a villain, but something more difficult: a true believer. The position her official biographer described was the one she'd held without deviation for her entire adult life. Country before everything else, without exception. She wasn't angry. That had always been true. Queen Mary didn't need to shout to dominate a room. She only needed to look at a woman and know whether she understood the rules. A royal daughter-in-law wasn't there to be happy. She was there to continue the line, protect the image, wear the right jewels, produce the right children, and never forget that the family was less important than the crown. Queen Mary's daughters-in-law learned that lesson in different ways. Some survived it, some benefited from it. One refused it completely, and that refusal nearly broke the monarchy. Subscribe for more stories like this.